Press release number 0077 from the Transitional Government. The Transitional Government informs the national public of the arrest of a group of marginal elements of the Malian Armed Security Forces for criminal offenses aimed at destabilizing the institutions of the Republic.
Mali woke up on August 14, 2025, to shocking news. A coup d'etat had been crushed before it could even begin. Generals arrested, civilians implicated, and a French national accused of working for foreign intelligence was caught in the heart of it all. But who were these plotters? Why strike now? And what does France have to do with it? Let's find that out. When the Malian government announced that an attempted coup had been foiled, it was not just a piece of breaking news. It was the revelation of a political earthquake narrowly avoided. The official statement described a conspiracy that had been silently building since the start of August, spreading through the barracks, trickling into civilian circles, and finally surfacing in the dramatic arrests of August 14. What stood out most in the government's communiqué was the precision with which the operation was described. Officials stressed that the security services had been vigilant, professional, and decisive, giving the impression of a state apparatus that had been watching closely, waiting for the right moment to strike. According to insiders, surveillance had been underway for weeks, monitoring communications between high-ranking officers and their civilian contacts. The sweep of arrests that followed was swift and calculated, a preemptive strike rather than a panicked reaction. The individuals taken into custody represented a cross-section of power and influence. Senior officers of the armed forces, men with decades of service, were handcuffed alongside civilians accused of acting as facilitators. And then there was the figure who instantly transformed the story from an internal rebellion into an international scandal. Jean-Christian Bernard Vézillier, the French national accused of operating under the cover of foreign intelligence. His arrest was not presented as incidental. It was framed as proof that the coup attempt was not just a domestic act of defiance, but the product of outside hands working to unseat Mali's leadership. This framing mattered. By immediately linking the plot to foreign interference, the transitional government sent two clear messages. First, that the threat was larger than internal dissent. Second, that Mali's sovereignty remained under siege from forces beyond its borders. For a junta that has built its legitimacy on the promise of defending independence, the timing of this revelation was no accident. But beyond the official statement, the atmosphere in Bamako told its own story. The capital remained tense throughout the day of the announcement. Roadblocks were reported near strategic sites, military vehicles were seen patrolling key avenues, and residents spoke of a sudden heaviness in the air, as if the city itself had narrowly escaped a plunge into the unknown. Though the government insisted it was fully in control, ordinary Malians were left asking what might have happened had the conspiracy advanced further. Rumors began to spread quickly. Some claimed the plotters had been planning coordinated strikes on government buildings. Others suggested that certain units within the military had been approached with promises of power sharing if they agreed to join. Though unverified, these whispers underscored the fragility of a country where past coups have repeatedly reshaped political life. Unlike those earlier seizures of power, however, this attempt did not announce itself with gunfire or tanks in the streets. It collapsed quietly, almost invisibly, before most citizens even knew it existed. The question that immediately followed was inevitable. How deep did the rot go? The fact that brigadier generals, men entrusted with leading Mali's armed forces in a time of war, had allegedly turned against the state raised fears of division at the highest levels. And if civilians and a foreign agent were part of the network, then the plot could not simply be dismissed as a small clique of disgruntled officers. For the transitional government, portraying the operation as marginal elements was essential to reassure the population. Yet the scale of the arrests, multiple generals, lieutenant colonels, civilians, and a foreigner, suggested that this was more than just an isolated grumble of discontent. It hinted at deeper fractures within Mali's power structure, fractures that outside actors may have been eager to exploit. That leaves us with the central mystery. Who exactly were these plotters, and what drove them to risk everything against a government that claims to stand for national sovereignty? To answer that, we need to look more closely at the individuals arrested, their positions, their motivations, and the foreign connections that turned this coup attempt into an international affair. The names released by Mali's transitional government painted a picture far more troubling than a ragtag band of disloyal soldiers. Among the arrested were senior officers with decades of service, men who had once been considered pillars of the national army. Brigadier Generals Abbas Dembele and Nima Sagara were not fringe figures. They were seasoned commanders with influence inside barracks and credibility among troops. Their involvement transformed the failed coup from an act of desperation into something that suggested calculated ambition. For many Malians, the betrayal stung deeply. Generals are not just symbols of authority. They embody the trust that soldiers place in their chain of command. When men of such stature allegedly turn against the state, it forces the country to confront an uncomfortable truth. Loyalty at the top is never guaranteed. In societies where the military doubles as both a defense force and a political power broker, shifting allegiances can become the deciding factor in whether governments rise or fall. Yet the plot did not stop with uniforms. The government statement also pointed to civilians and political figures who had allegedly played supporting roles. While no names were disclosed, officials hinted at actors drawn from Mali's political class and civil society. These were not men and women carrying rifles, but individuals accused of offering money, networks, and legitimacy to a military takeover. Their participation suggests that discontent was not confined to barracks. It had spilled into civilian spaces where frustration with the junta's tight grip still lingers. And then there was the most controversial figure of all, Jean Christian Bernard Vézilier, the French national. His arrest gave the story its international dimension. Authorities accused him of acting as a conduit, linking Malian officers with foreign states and intelligence structures. To the junta, he was proof that this was not merely an internal power struggle, but a destabilization project engineered from abroad. For the population, he became the embodiment of an old suspicion that external actors never truly let go of Mali, even when pushed out the front door. So why attempt a coup now? Timing, as always, is revealing. Mali is in the middle of a precarious transition, one that has dragged on since the 2020 and 2021 coups that brought Assimi Goïta and his allies to power. Elections, promised but delayed, remain uncertain. At the same time, the government has doubled down on its narrative of sovereignty, cutting ties with France and leaning on new partnerships with Russia. For some insiders, this reorientation has meant losing privileges tied to the old order, whether contracts, influence, or access to foreign aid channels. On the ground, frustrations persist as well. The economy remains fragile, sanctions have strained households, and insurgent violence has not disappeared despite the government's promises. For political opponents, the transition is dragging too long. For ordinary citizens, hope is often overshadowed by hardship. In this context, a coup attempt can find fuel in both ambition and resentment. Ambitious officers might see an opportunity to seize control, while foreign actors, unsettled by Mali's pivot away from the West, might see utility in fanning discontent. This dual dynamic of internal fracture and external meddling makes the plot distinct. Unlike earlier coups where soldiers seized power openly, this one appears to have been more discreet, spread across different layers of society, and quietly cultivated through clandestine connections. It was not tanks rolling toward the presidential palace. It was a network threading through uniforms, politics, and foreign corridors. The government's swift crackdown prevented the conspiracy from blooming, but it also opened a bigger question. If a French national was indeed involved at such a high level, then Mali's suspicions about its former colonial ruler moved from rhetoric to reality. And that question hangs heavy in Bamako today. Why does France keep reappearing at the center of Mali's political storms? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The arrest of a French national accused of espionage did not land in a vacuum. For Malians, it echoed years of suspicion, resentment, and bitter history with their former colonial ruler. France has always loomed large in Mali's political storms, sometimes as a military partner, other times as a scapegoat, but rarely as a neutral bystander. To understand why France is once again in the spotlight, we need to trace the shifting arc of a relationship that has gone from protector to pariah. When insurgents first swept across northern Mali in 2012, seizing cities like Timbuktu and threatening Bamako, it was French troops who intervened. Operation Serval, launched in January 2013, was hailed by many Malians as a lifeline. French forces pushed militants out of urban centers and stabilized a crumbling state. But the gratitude was short-lived. Over time, what began as a rescue evolved into a long and heavy presence. France morphed its mission into Operation Barkhane, expanding across the Sahel with thousands of troops and billions of euros in military spending. Yet despite the investment, insurgency persisted. Attacks continued, civilian casualties mounted, and ordinary Malians began to question why, after years of French boots on the ground, the violence seemed endless. For critics, France's presence began to look less like a solution and more like a trap, a way of ensuring dependency rather than building true sovereignty. Anti-French protests grew louder, fueled by a generation tired of colonial-era paternalism, dressed up as security assistants. The 2020 coup, led by Assimi Goïta and his fellow officers, brought these tensions to the surface. Suddenly, the language of Mali's leaders shifted. Sovereignty, independence, and dignity became rallying cries. France, once presented as an indispensable ally, was recast as a meddler who had overstayed its welcome. By 2022, French forces were told to leave, their departure cheered by crowds in Bamako, waving Malian and Russian flags. The message was unmistakable. Mali was breaking free, but France's shadow never disappeared. Even after the military exit, suspicions lingered that Paris was still pulling strings through intelligence networks, political contacts, and economic pressure. The government framed almost every challenge as part of a wider foreign agenda, and in the Malian imagination that often meant France. The arrest of Jean-Christian Bernard Vézilier seemed to confirm what many already believed, that Paris was still trying to manipulate Mali's fate, this time from behind closed doors rather than through tanks and helicopters. For the junta, the French angle is more than a convenient narrative. It is a tool of political survival. By casting dissenting generals and politicians as pawns of a foreign power, the government turns internal opposition into a question of sovereignty. This framing not only justifies crackdowns, but also cements Goïta's image as the defender of Mali's independence against outside interference. In the zero-sum game of Malian politics, branding one's opponents as agents of France is as potent as it gets. Yet the issue is not only political, it is existential. Mali is still locked in a war with insurgents who thrive on instability. Every time the country experiences political fractures, insurgent groups seize the chance to expand. This raises the most pressing question of all. If France's influence is being pushed out, if generals are being arrested for treason, and if foreign meddling is still suspected, what does that mean for Mali's ability to hold the line against insurgents? The coup attempt was stopped, but the fight against insurgency rages on. Which leads us to the next critical question. Could this conspiracy have crippled Mali's war against insurgent groups and undone years of sacrifice on the battlefield? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If there is one battlefield where Mali cannot afford hesitation, it is the war against insurgent groups. For more than a decade, Mali has been at the center of the Sahel's insurgencies, carving out territories, terrorizing villages, and ambushing soldiers. In this fragile environment, even a whisper of instability in the capital reverberates across frontline outposts. That is why the government framed the foiled coup not only as a political challenge but as a direct threat to national survival. Coup fracture militaries. They divide loyalties, create rival commands, and weaken morale. If Generals Dembele and Sagara had succeeded in rallying more officers to their cause, the army could have splintered into competing factions. At that moment, insurgent groups operating in the Mopti, Gao, and Kidal regions would have had the opening they had long been waiting for, an overstretched army distracted by infighting. Instead of facing coordinated offensives, militants could have launched raids on unguarded positions, reclaimed lost ground, and expanded their networks deeper into rural communities. The timing of the conspiracy also raised alarms. August is a dangerous month in Mali's security calendar. Rains flood rural roads, complicating supply lines for troops, while insurgents exploit the terrain to attack isolated villages. A coup during this season would not just have been a political crisis, it could have triggered cascading military failures. The government's narrative is clear. Those who plotted were not only betraying their oath, they were playing directly into the hands of insurgents. Beyond the battlefield, the political symbolism of a coup would have been just as damaging. Counterinsurgency requires international partnerships, whether with neighboring Niger and Burkina Faso or with new allies like Russia. If Mali had fallen into yet another round of military upheaval, external partners might have hesitated, leaving critical support in limbo. Even among Mali's citizens, trust in the army's ability to defend the population could have eroded. In a war where legitimacy is as important as firepower, the coup's success would have left the state vulnerable from both within and without. This is why the junta has doubled down on its portrayal of the failed plot as a foreign-sponsored sabotage. By linking the conspiracy to outside powers, it frames the arrest not just as a political purge, but as the safeguarding of the nation's very existence. For Assimi Goïta's government, the message is simple. Without stability at the top, the fight against insurgency collapses, and Mali risks becoming a failed state. In this way, the coup attempt becomes a tool to reinforce the argument that military rule is not a choice, but a necessity. But this narrative is not without controversy. Critics argue that by constantly invoking the specter of insurgency, the junta justifies indefinite delays to democratic transition. Every threat becomes a reason to hold on to power longer. Every crisis a validation of their claim to indispensability. This paradox defines Mali today. The very real threat of insurgents coexists with a political class eager to weaponize it. Still, one fact remains unshaken. If the coup had succeeded, insurgent groups would have been the biggest winners. Villages in central Mali might have fallen back under militant control, soldiers at the front might have been abandoned, and years of painstaking bloody progress might have been undone overnight. The foiled plot, then, was more than a clash for power. It was a bullet dodged in Mali's existential fight against insurgency. Yet while the government insists that the crisis is under control, the true test lies outside the palace walls. How do ordinary Malians view this drama? Do they believe the junta's version of events, or do they suspect a convenient narrative crafted to strengthen its grip on power? To understand that, we must turn from the corridors of Bamako's leadership to the voices of its people. On the streets of Bamako, the government's dramatic announcement stirred both relief and unease. Supporters of the junta celebrated the arrests, waving flags and praising the vigilance of the security services. To them, the discovery of a French national at the center of the alleged plot was vindication of what they had long suspected, that their sovereignty is under constant attack, not only from insurgents in the desert, but also from foreign capitals unwilling to see Mali stand on its own. For these voices, the foiled coup was proof that Assimi Goïta's leadership is indispensable, the last barrier between Mali and chaos. But beyond the celebratory chants, a quieter current of skepticism flowed. Many Malians remember how past governments have invoked conspiracies, both real and exaggerated, to justify crackdowns and extend their grip on power. Civil society leaders, wary of history repeating itself, demanded evidence. They called on the junta to produce concrete proof of the Frenchman's involvement and to ensure fair and transparent trials for the arrested generals. If everything is hidden behind closed doors, one activist warned, people will wonder whether this was truly a coup or simply a purge. This tension between belief and doubt reveals the fragile social contract that exists between the junta and the people. On one hand, Goïta's government draws legitimacy from its anti-colonial stance, positioning itself as the defender of sovereignty in a world still marked by external meddling. On the other hand, Malians remain wary of military rulers who promise stability but deliver prolonged transitions, economic hardship, and restricted freedoms. The foiled coup, depending on perspective, is either a demonstration of strength or a reminder of the military's monopoly on power. Outside Mali, reactions were measured but telling. France remained silent in the immediate aftermath, unwilling to inflame accusations. Regional leaders in West Africa watch closely, wary of contagion. The Sahel is no stranger to coups, and each one risks rippling across borders. For Mali's allies, Russia, Burkina Faso, and Niger, The arrests reinforce their narrative that the region must shield itself from Western interference. For Western capitals, however, the story confirmed their worst fears, that Mali is sliding deeper into authoritarianism while leaning ever closer to rival powers. The international dimension only complicates Mali's domestic debate. As the junta pushes the narrative of foreign interference, it risks feeding nationalism, but alienating potential partners who might otherwise support the transition back to civilian rule. For ordinary Malians, this tension plays out in the form of economic uncertainty. Sanctions remain a painful reminder of the costs of isolation, while promises of foreign investment from new allies have yet to translate into tangible relief for families struggling with food prices and job scarcity. And so the question lingers: where does Mali go from here? The foiled coup demonstrates both the resilience and the fragility of the current order. Resilience, because the security services acted swiftly and prevented disaster. Fragility, because the very fact that generals, civilians, and a foreign agent were allegedly conspiring shows how brittle the foundations of governance remain. For the junta, the path forward will be a balancing act. If it leans too heavily on repression, branding every critic a traitor, it risks losing the very popular support that sustains it. If it opens space for genuine political dialogue, it may secure a transition that strengthens legitimacy rather than eroding it. For Malians, the demand is simple but profound: security, dignity, and a government they can trust. The foiled coup has not answered whether these goals are within reach. Instead, it has sharpened the stakes. Mali's struggle is no longer just against insurgents in the desert or spies in the shadows. It is against the constant erosion of trust. Trust between rulers and ruled, between citizens and soldiers, between Mali and the outside world. The fate of the republic may depend on whether that trust can be rebuilt before the next crisis arrives. Was this a coup or just a power play? Is France still pulling Mali's strings? Let us know in the comments section. Can Mali trust the junta to protect sovereignty? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.